So with our next lecture, we're going to focus in greater detail on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So some of the reading that I've assigned is directly related to that, particularly the assigned reading from David Shipler's Arab and Jews, which I strongly encourage you to at least read some of. Though I think you'll find it a very interesting reading. It's basically there's kind of a tradition in journalism that after you've been posted in an area for a long period of time, you've developed some kind of insight about it. Upon retirement, you write a book, collecting various stories that you think help to illustrate the nature of the conflict. And that's exactly what Arab and Jew is. And what's kind of nice about that is, I mean, I hate to admit it, but journalists generally write better than historians. So, I mean, it's like reading a collection of actually very engaging stories, but does provide some insight into the personal nature of the conflict. But with this lecture, we're going to look at kind of more political developments, particularly as relate to the development of the Israeli state. And what's really interesting is, a lot of people were surprised that Israel actually did so well in its first war following independence in 1948. With the Arab states, which kind of came across as a David versus Goliath kind of story. This actually wasn't the case. I mean, people who have a greater degree of knowledge about, or did even at that time have a greater degree of knowledge about the region, understood that in some ways Israel was much better prepared militarily and in other regards as well. So first of all, I mean, the war ended with the newly created state of Israel being much larger than what had been called for in the partition plan. So just to kind of refresh our memory on that. The territories that were not part of Israel, as far as what had constituted Palestine, the West Bank, a reference to the fact that this territory is on the west bank of the Jordan River, that was incorporated into the now independent state of Jordan. And then on the other side, you had a strip of territory around the city of Gaza, often referred to as the Gaza Strip, that became incorporated into Egypt. And finally, we should note that Jerusalem ended up being a divided city, with the western half being also the more modern half under Israeli control, and the eastern half inclusive of the old city, which would have been the oldest part of the city, but also where most of the more important holy sites were located, including the western wall of the Temple Mount. That would end up under Jordanian control. So why was Israel so successful? And a big part of this story has to do with the fact that by the time Israel declared its independence, it really had developed all the institutions of state. It really was prepared to hit the ground running, so to speak. So we need to look at some developments from the mandatory period when it was under British control. So a number of different institutions that were established pretty early on. First of all, the term the Yishuv, generally referring to the Jewish community in Palestine during the British mandatory period. So a number of key institutions that in effect allowed the Jewish community to somewhat operate independently. Remember, part of the mandate was that the British were supposed to prepare the local population for independence. And in the case of the mandate for Palestine, it incorporated the terms of the Balfour Declaration. So in a sense, this idea of creating a Jewish national home also meant helping to develop institutions that would allow that Jewish national home to be self-governing. And that actually became a source of conflict. There was always a feeling that the British were doing more to help the Jewish population than the Arab one, and there's some truth to that. So in any event, a number of important institutions from the start. We have established in 1923 the Jewish Agency, which in effect reflected a kind of official recognition by the British that the Jewish community was some kind of independent political entity. So in all its dealings with the Jewish community, the British would actually interact with this agency, which served as a quasi-governmental organization that could speak on behalf of the Jewish community, and in some ways did more to administer it than the British. Even earlier than that, we have the Va'ad Le'umi, known also as the Jewish National Council of Palestine, or Jewish People's Council, which would be a better direct translation. And that was established in 1920. So that became the kind of almost equivalent of a parliamentary body, the main national institution of the Jewish community in Palestine during the British Mandate period. And then you had also a political department, which in a sense almost constituted a kind of foreign ministry, if you will, right? So the political department, which was connected to the Va'ad Leumi, was responsible for relations with the Arabs and also facilitated ties between the Jewish agency and the British government. Now, another very important organization, which technically wasn't, at least in its original incarnation, a government or a governmental institution, but more kind of a labor organization, was the Histadrut, literally meaning Haklalit Shel Ha'avdim Be'eretz Yisrael, the General Federation of Laborers in the Land of Israel, which was founded in 1920. So even though, it's in a sense representing labor, but it's also going to be instrumental in the development of a kind of Jewish economy, right, that emphasizes, for instance, Jewish labor over Arab labor. Is also going to pool resources to invest in the development of industries and so forth. So, eventually transitioning into the Israeli economy, if you will. And of course, we should note that from a pretty early point, we have the development of what will become the Israeli army, and that is the Haganah. Haganah, literally Hebrew for the defense, and initially affiliated with Histadrut, but at some point becoming kind of more of its own independent institution. And they were able to, the Jewish community was able to persuade the British that they needed to have their own kind of defensive forces to defend the Jewish community against Arab attacks. But nonetheless, right, you can see that they're laying the foundations here for what will become an Israeli army. And with respect to all of these bodies, there is nothing equivalent on the other side. That represents the Arabs either politically, economically, or militarily. The expectation there was that the British were supposed to fulfill those functions on behalf of the Arabs. So obviously this is going to put the Palestinian Arab population in a weak position after the British leave. Now, in talking about political developments, we should also note that from an early point we have the development of what will become the dominant political party in Israel for many decades. Though based on recent elections, it looks like its term as a viable party might be coming to an end. But in any event, this would be the Maipai, founded in the 1930s. So it became the dominant political party in Israeli politics. Eventually would morph into the Labor Party. Which in a sense it always was, right? I mean, Mapai is kind of an acronym for Miflaget Polai Yeres Israel, literally the Land of Israel Workers' Party. And it actually formed through the merger of a number of smaller parties, some of which were much more right-wing, such as the Poa'el Zion, the original Labor Unity Party, that was headed by David Ben-Gurion, who would eventually become the head of the Maipai party. And in fact, by the early 1930s, David Ben-Gurion had taken over the party and was, for all intents and purposes, the leader of the Yishuv in Palestine. And he would become the first prime minister after Israel declared its independence in 1948, and would continue to play a very instrumental role in this kind of transition period as the Israeli state became completely independent. But as you can see, it had a lot of material to work with, right? I mean, all the institutions of government were pretty much in place as of the day that Israel declared its independence. The Haganah, of course, would be transformed into the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, Tzava HaHaganah LaYisrael, the Force for the Defense of Israel. And almost one of the first things they did would be to incorporate a number of smaller militant groups that had been operating independently until then, such as the Irgun, headed by Menachem Begin, and the Lehi, both of which, you might remember, the Irgun had been responsible for the bombing of the King David Hotel, and so both the Lehi and Irgun had been involved in kind of more kind of terrorist type acts against the British. But with Israeli independence, it's kind of, all is forgiven. We just need to come together now. As far as the Israeli government, what emerges with independence is a parliamentary democracy. And you'll hear a lot of criticism of Israeli democracy, inasmuch as it really does, in a sense, promote the interests and favor the Israeli Jewish population. And let me point out that with Israeli independence, roughly 20% of this newly created Israeli state, and we're not talking here about anyone in the West Bank or Gaza, about 20% of that population, even until today, and these are citizens of Israel, are in fact non-Jewish. They are Palestinian Arab. Israelis sometimes prefer to call them Israeli Arabs, but I've yet to meet a Palestinian of Israeli citizenship who prefers to go by that title. Very often these individuals are to some degree marginalized within the political system, but it isn't really a question of whether Israel is a democracy or not. I would argue that it's more a matter that it is a democracy that intentionally marginalizes one group. If we're talking about kind of the mechanics of government, it is a proper parliamentary democracy. But the problem is that it tends to exclude, for various reasons, a particular element of its population, and that doesn't even begin to speak of the fact that currently the very large Palestinian Arab populations of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which effectively are under Israeli occupation. Even if in theory Gaza is supposedly independent, everything is pretty much controlled by Israel. Those individuals are not represented at all. They are living under effectively, to some degree or another, a military occupation. But in terms of the actual functioning of the Israeli government, the dominant body is in fact the parliament, known as the Knesset. It consists of 120 representatives. Power lies in the hands of the prime minister. And hopefully most of you are aware that in a parliamentary system, people don't vote for individuals for the office of prime minister. They vote for parties with the understanding that whichever party does best, the head of the party will end up being the prime minister. Now, in the case of Israel, you have a number of parties, some of which are relatively small, but it's very rare that one party has an absolute majority, meaning that very often whatever party ends up dominating has to form coalitions involving other parties. And this is very typical of parliamentary democracy, for instance, in Europe. So the first prime minister, of course, was David Ben-Gurion. There is, in fact, a president in Israel, the office of the president, but it's largely a ceremonial office, much as, and many people might be surprised to learn that as Germany has a president, same basic deal. Right? And the first president of Israel will be Chaim Weizmann, who you might remember had been head of the World Zionist Organization at the time of the signing of the Balfour Declaration. So it really becomes also kind of like honorary position to be granted. In theory, after an election, the president helps to determine which parties did best, which one has the best chance of forming a coalition to govern, and so forth. But it really isn't an office that holds much power. Now, from the beginning of the creation of Israel, they're going to be confronted with a division within the Jewish community. So you do have a division between Jews and Arabs, including within Israel proper. We should note that it will be a while before Palestinian Arabs who are in Israel are granted, at least in principle, full rights as citizens, very often being monitored, not permitted to travel freely, and so forth. To give you an idea of how they are marginalized, even today, you have political parties that are Arab and that very often win seats in the parliament. But there is no Israeli Jewish party that would ever invite them to be part of a coalition. It would simply make that coalition illegitimate in the eyes of too many Jews. But think about that. I mean, they're basically saying that a particular group of citizens somehow are not fully embraced, right? That you wouldn't consider them sufficiently part of the body politic, that having a political coalition in power involving them is somehow legitimate. But as I mentioned, there's also a division between Jews. There are two basic categories or I don't want to say sects, right? Because it's in some ways more cultural division than reflective of different religious beliefs or anything like that. But Jews usually fall into one of two categories, either Sephardim or Ashkenazim. Now, when most people in this country think of Jews, they're really thinking of Ashkenazi Jews, right? Mostly Jews originating from Northern and Eastern Europe. Ashkenaz is actually a medieval Hebrew name for Germany. Most of them, before adopting Hebrew, which is a kind of, uh, as far as it being a kind of uh, language of day-to-day conversation, is a modern invention related to the development of Jewish nationalism. Of course, Hebrew is now the language of Israel, but that wasn't actually the primary language of Ashkenazi Jews historically. From medieval times until the mid-20th century, they mostly spoke Yiddish, which is actually German. It's basically a medieval form of German, but often written in Hebrew letters. Sephardic Jews, and another term sometimes used is Spanish Jews, mostly though affiliated with, well, definitely Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, but also many Middle Eastern countries. Um, so also coming of Arabic and Persian backgrounds, very often fluent in those languages, much as Ashkenazi Jews spoke Yiddish. Sephardic Jews also had their own kind of particular language known as Ladino, a medieval form of Spanish written in Hebrew letters, but of a very different background. Now, if we're thinking about the early history of the creation of the Israeli state, who constituted the bulk of Zionist Jews, who were the most active in promoting the creation of a Jewish national home, later a Jewish state in Palestine. That was predominantly Ashkenazi Jews. But after the creation of Israel, and given the level of hostility between Israel and the neighboring Arab states, it would kind of polarize the situation such that large numbers of Jews in Arab countries felt compelled to leave. Sometimes this was actually promoted by Israel. For instance, even in the case where you had spies operating in countries like Iraq and Egypt who would try to kind of raise tensions between Jews and Arabs with the idea that eventually Jews would be forced to leave and make their way to the Israeli state. So you're going to see large numbers of Jews in the 1950s and onward coming from places like Morocco, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Many of them not Zionists, many of them who were quite content where they were, but now being compelled to leave. And from the Israeli point of view, this was great because really one of the most important things early on was to try and get as many Jews into the country as possible, right, to ensure a Jewish majority. So from a very early point, Israel has this kind of tension between, on the one hand, promoting itself as a Jewish state, which of course raises questions about the status of non-Jews in the state, and also that it is a functioning democracy. And to some degree, I mean, I think it's not too hard to see where these two things might actually get in the way of each other. Sephardic Jews, when they arrive in Israel, are often treated as inferior. So from the point of view of European or Ashkenazi Jews, they often see them as essentially being too Arab in their culture, as not particularly educated. So many of them are going to end up being marginalized. Many of them are forcibly settled in abandoned Arab towns on the periphery, where very often they're being shot at, being forced to work in newly created factories or on you had the I think we talked very briefly about the kibbutzim, these kind of communal agricultural settlements. And now you're going to see the creation of a kind of more capitalistic version of that known as moshav or moshavim, the plural. Many of them are kind of forced to settle on that. Many of these Sephardic Jews are actually quite highly educated, had been very successful business people and so forth. So as you might imagine, they're going to kind of resent the fact that they're being, in some ways, repressed. So this is kind of like, in a sense, for the next 20 years or so, kind of one of the main concerns, trying to forge a shared Israeli identity out of two very distinct Jewish communities on the one hand, and also in light of the fact that a significant part of the population is not Jewish at all. Well, eventually we come to the Six-Day War, and that's really going to just radically alter the situation. So as you might recall, Israel did very well from a military point of view, right? Within 6 days, they were victorious, had defeated their Arab enemies, had taken control of vast tracts of land, including the West Bank, Gaza, but also Sinai they took from Egypt. And if you look up in the north, the Golan Heights that had belonged to Syria. And so, as you might imagine, this felt like a really celebratory moment in Israel. But even from the beginning, some of the Israeli leaders realized that this actually could become a problem down the road. First of all, they had just taken in a huge number of Palestinians along with this territory, right? So the conflict, first of all, created about 300,000 additional Palestinian refugees. So there's a problem that already was pretty serious going back to 48, 49, but now becomes more difficult to resolve. But if you think about just the people who, even who stayed in their homes, remained in the towns from whence they came, Israel now is responsible for administering a Arab population of roughly 1.5 million individuals. So the question is, what do you do with that? Now, there's kind of two different ways of looking at this early on. On the one hand, some Israeli leaders, particularly those who've always kind of downplayed the religious dimension of Jewish identity and reminding everyone that Zionism is essentially a secular nationalist movement. They tended to look at the territories as bargaining chips, right? We can use this to actually negotiate peace where, we'll give the territory back, but in return, we want a real peace, kind of recognition of Israel, ideally as, in some fashion, a Jewish state, and then a normalization of relations. The problem is on the other hand, there's going to be this tremendous temptation to keep the territories, particularly the West Bank, where many of the stories associated with the Bible, which even if you're taking a more secular view of Jewish history, right, like very often seeing the Bible as somehow reflective of the history of the Jewish people, not just a religious text. Many of those stories take place in what is the West Bank. Many of the most important towns that are mentioned in the Bible correspond to the West Bank. From an early point, everyone agrees that there will be no consideration of dividing Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to remain unified as the eternal capital of Israel. So in that regard, there's tremendous agreement between those who are more secular, those who are more religious-minded. But we're going to see a kind of emerging division over what to do with the West Bank. And those who are kind of more religiously minded, and just the fact of Israel's success is going to, in some ways, encourage a kind of religious perspective, that somehow this is God's hand operating in history on behalf of the Jewish people. Those kind of individuals are going to promote the idea that we should be establishing Jewish settlements in the West Bank, maybe in the other territories as well, and really should consider not giving them up. Well, from the international point of view, the manner to resolve the current situation is pretty clear. From their point of view, first of all, they consider, by international law, and this is reflected in UN Security Council Resolution 242, which really is very important. I mean, this is going to become kind of the basis for pretty much every suggested peace plan until very recently about how to resolve the conflict, right? This becomes kind of the starting point. But from the point of view of international law, territory occupied through conflict cannot be held onto. It's considered illegal, but there is kind of a recognition that Israel does have some legitimate concerns, so kind of a willingness to accept that the territories might constitute a kind of bargaining chip for recognition. So Security Council Resolution 242 is pretty simple. On the one hand, it calls for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. On the other hand, it asserts the right of every state in the area to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats and acts of force. So I think the second part is pretty clear. Basically supporting the idea that Israel has the right to be recognized as a legitimate state, and that relations should be normalized, right? Not just simply an absence of conflict, but real peace, right? Kind of establishment of diplomatic, political, economic, and maybe even cultural ties between Israel and its neighboring Arab states. The first one might seem very clear what it's saying, but I do want to draw attention to the fact that it's missing a word, a very key word, and this is not by accident. Missing is the word "the," as in the territories. All right, so basically that means that in theory, right, Israel only has to withdraw from some of the territories. Now, there is one legitimate reason for this. There was kind of talk of swapping territory. For instance, before the Six-Day War, there's this very narrow strip of Israeli territory, only about 10 miles wide between the West Bank and Mediterranean. Maybe beefing up that particular part of Israel to make it, less likely that in a war Israel could be split in two. But I mean, if you're an Israeli more of a mind to settle the territories and maybe even hold on to as much of it as possible, you're probably going to read this particular point in a very specific way, right? That Israel has not promised to withdraw from any particular part of the West Bank. There's nothing said about how much of the West Bank. So this is, part of what has to be negotiated. From a Palestinian point of view, very different take, right? I mean, willing to consider some minor adjustments, but for the most part, their understanding is that Israel must withdraw from pretty much all of the West Bank. Now, after the Six-Day War, at that point, from the point of view of many Palestinians, it was pretty clear that if they were waiting for the various Arab states to come to their rescue and liberate them, they were going to be waiting a long time. I mean, this was a complete and utterly humiliating defeat for the Arab world. And it's from this point forward that a distinctly Palestinian organization, and more specifically, the Palestine Liberation Organization, Munazzamat al-Tahrir al-Filistiniya, more commonly referred to as the PLO, is going to come to the fore. Now, it actually had been created in 1964 and initially was really under the control of a body called the Arab League, representing the various Arab governments in the region, more specifically pretty much under the thumb of Nasser. So, couldn't really operate independently. We should also know that the PLO is actually not a single organization, but kind of a confederacy of organizations, many of whom have different points of view, different ideas, and employ different military tactics. So what we call an umbrella organization, right, representing various paramilitary Palestinian groups. So they were created initially to be kind of under the authority of the Arab League, but the idea that they somehow represented the Palestinian people as a nation, so even if they didn't have their own nation state, they had a seat at the table. But increasingly, they're going to start operating independently after the Six-Day War. There's kind of a feeling among Palestinians we have to take matters into our own hands. In some ways, you could argue that up until now, it wasn't really an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but more an Israeli-Arab conflict. Now it's going to become more an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The most important figure in the PLO is going to be the head of the most important Palestinian paramilitary group in it, and that would be Yasser Arafat, who ends up being chairman of the PLO from 1969 until his death in 2004. And during that period, to be quite frank, one of the most recognizable figures internationally. Very famous for always wearing the checkered keffiyeh. How did he end up being the leader of the PLO? Partly because he had shown his ability militarily during the Battle of Karama in early 1968. So it's kind of one of the first major engagements involving the Palestinians fighting against the Israelis after the Six-Day War. And to be sure, I mean, from a strictly technical point of view, it was an Israeli military victory and fairly decisive, but they did put up a really good fight. They took out a few Israeli tanks, a fair number of Israeli soldiers, and this was very encouraging. That a small militant group could actually inflict more damage on Israel, it would appear, than the United Arab States. So that's kind of what's happening on the Palestinian side. And for the most part, they're going to engage in kind of militant tactics, many of which, from the point of view of Israel and sometimes the international community, constitute terrorism. For instance, at some point, hijacking planes and forcing them to land in Amman in Jordan, where they're blown up, though I should note after people are taken off the plane. But there are also attacks on Israeli civilians and so forth. From the Palestinian point of view, they are freedom fighters that are demanding that the international community and that Israel take their grievances seriously. Well, what's going on the Israeli side during this? Well, first of all, Israel is getting quite cocky after the Six-Day War. There's kind of a growing feeling that, you know what, maybe we don't need to really negotiate a peace. I mean, what are they going to do to us? And against this background, we're going to see the rise of a new political party called the Likud, initially headed up by Menachem Begin, who you might remember had been the head of the Irgun at the time when it was bombing things like the King David Hotel. So he would later become a leading spokesman for an ultra-nationalist, very right-wing party known as Herut, which basically is saying forget about giving up the West Bank. He called for the creation of a greater Israel that would include not just the West Bank, but even in principal parts of what at that point were the state of Jordan. So he was like, no negotiation. Eventually, Herut is going to come together with a few more centrist parties to form Likud. And by the way, Likud is currently the governing party under a fellow named Benjamin Netanyahu. But their first victory is in 1977, which sees Menachem Begin become Israel's new prime minister. So the Likud party, and this is in their charter, calls for the annexation and settlement of the entire land, Eretz Yisrael, land of Israel as they call it, to include the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and certainly all of Jerusalem. Of particular importance is the West Bank, which they don't refer to as the West Bank. They tend to refer to it as Judea and Samaria, the ancient biblical names corresponding to that territory. And so they are completely opposed to Palestinian statehood and very strong advocates of Jewish settlement in the West Bank. Having said that, I should note that, and from this point forward, you're going to see kind of the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank in particular, but not only under Likud, even when the Labor Party is dominant. And so at some point, you really have kind of these two parties that become really prominent, the Likud and Labor. But even Labor, in some ways, is going to promote settlement, maybe not as vociferously, not as vocally, and maybe not involving as much territory. But from the point of view of Palestinians, and I actually had a Palestinian friend tell me once, he said, like, Likud wants to shoot you with a gun, Labor wants to shoot you, but they want to put a silencer on the gun so you don't hear it. Right, so kind of want to seem, from his point of view, is that they just kind of want to look like they're more interested in a peaceful resolution. But Likud definitely kind of much more vocally promoting that kind of policy. Now, as I mentioned, Israel had also become somewhat cocky, kind of really feeling quite self-assured that the Arab states wouldn't dare to attack them, that there was nothing they could do, and that is going to catch them off guard.